So, hello and welcome to a special episode of Tolkien with Friends. Today, Callie and I are excited to welcome Chris and Carlos from the Swolhirrim podcast. Welcome, guys!
Hey yo.
Hello.
Yay! And for all of our listeners who may not know the Swolhirrim, shame on you. And also, can you guys let us know more about your podcast and where we can find you?
Yeah.
Go for it,
So
Chris.
we are
Carlos, you
the
sounded upset.
Swolhirrim.
You were like, ah,
I know.
no.
I was like, wait a minute. Well, he usually just passes it over to me. So this time I was like, I'll just take initiative.
I always pass it over to Chris.
So we are the Swolhirrim. Carlos and I met each other at a CrossFit gym, and we learned that we were both Tolkien fans. And so fitness and Tolkien, it's a good place where, it's that Venn diagram. It's not a very big overlap, but there's an overlap there,
I love that.
And so that's where we kind of found ourselves. So, I mean, on our podcast, if you've listened, we talk about fitness and we talk about Tolkien, and sometimes, not often, we mix those two things together, which is fun. But yeah, it's a good time. We've been doing it for. Do we swear on this podcast?
Yeah. Not a million,
Okay.
but a little.
I was just about to, and then I was like, "Ooh, wait a minute! I'm gonna hold off on that." But no. So we've been doing this for 2 years, right, Carlos?
Yeah, it's on like 2 years.
Yeah. So we've been doing this for about 2 years now, and it's fun. It's kind of crazy. We've been doing it for 2 years.
Yeah, that's wild.
Damn.
Yeah.
But
that is crazy.
We just barely got on. I mean, barely. I think it was back in March. We got on TikTok. Instagram is where you'll find like our Tolkien-based workouts. And right now,
And YouTube.
YouTube,
you might find like things from like a year and a half
a
ago.
long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, the title of this episode is it Canon? Just is the first thing I thought of when I was typing this. So if you haven't guessed, we are talking about canon and what that means. So I'll backtrack a little bit with so we're currently preparing for season 2 of Tolkien with Friends, which sounds weird to say. I never thought we would do seasons, but I think it makes sense because next up we'll be diving into Peter Jackson's second trilogy of films to compare to the book that kind of started it all in a lot of ways, The Hobbit. And having just finished Lord of the Rings and looking ahead to further adaptations, and even thinking about all the fervor around Rings of Power that happened, I thought this might be a good time to tackle the concept of canon, and particularly within fandom spaces. And while there are variations of how people define canon, the version that best fits the purposes for this conversation I found in the paper Canon versus Fanon, Folksonomies of Fan Culture by Kedra Shaney and Rizel Liebler. I did some research.
That's a lot of fan and can.
I know. So they defined it as canon from a pop culture standpoint is defined as the official storylines and backstories invented by the creators of television shows, movies, and books. And I liked this version because there were some things that were just calling it source material. But I liked the impetus on the creators part of it, because when we see things like how in modern franchises, and I'm thinking of things like Star Wars or Harry Potter, we see the thing get created, right? We see whether that's George Lucas or J.K. Rowling. And with Star Wars, it's George Lucas was the head of it, and there was a lot of things going on. There were novelizations, but they were part of the canon for a while, and then it got sold to Disney, and they retconned a lot of that storytelling and started just moving forward with their own specific storylines, right? And then with things like Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling she's still very much a part of the whole IP, and she has been releasing. I mean, I honestly am not as big into Harry Potter as I once was, but with things like Pottermore, where she was releasing new information, and that is, she's the creator of it, and I know some people don't necessarily consider it canon, but I think that it totally does fall into canon. It's from her brain, and it's her creation and and as far as like some of the backstories of like characters like McGonagall and things like that. But then, what I think is funny that even the Tolkien Gateway like addresses this. They have a whole page about Tolkien and canon, and they put it as it is difficult to speak of what is true in the context of Tolkien's legendarium, or which text should be considered part of the canon. And I was just thinking about this, and unlike many modern franchises, the one person who can really determine canon is no longer with us. And having only officially published a few works that we know during his lifetime, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and so on, everything else has been released after his death. But with things like the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, and I mean, even the Beren and Luthien, Children of Hurin, and even onto the history of Middle Earth, they contain inconsistencies and some discrepancies, and it's easy to see how defining canon in Middle Earth gets complicated. And full transparency, I feel like I'm still on my journey about learning all of these differences between like all these versions of the stories that he wrote, and just knowing that Christopher and now other scholars are like taking his notes and his pieces of his work and kind of compile and bringing them together to publish these works. So I'm really excited to have all of you here to kind of help me parse through these ideas, and with your knowledge of things like the Somme and Unfinished Tales and all of that. So I'd really love to hear from you on how you approach canon in Tolkien's Legendarium, and even how you think we should be addressing conversations around canon in larger fandom spaces.
Yeah. No, so like, I mean, I was paying attention to everything that Andy was saying, but I was looking at Carlos and it looked like Carlos had something to say. And I don't know if that's true, but no.
Carlos,
So,
like,
I
no
mean, no,
thoughts.
look, I actually,
Not
so
yet. Not yet.
I was really happy to hear, you ask us to be on this episode. And it's something that we've talked about before. I may also be the wrong person for
No,
this,
you're correct.
because I poo poo canon. And like what I mean by that is so like the other fandom, I don't love like other fantasies or anything like that, but I do love Marvel. I've loved Marvel comic books since a kid. I loved reading X-Men. I loved all the cartoons growing up. I love everything. One of the things that always frustrates me with the Marvel universe, well, the fans of the Marvel universe, is we now have like the MCU,
Mm-hmm.
right? And people are like, well, that's not how it happened in the comic. Yeah, no shit. That's because it's a different universe. It doesn't have to be the same because it's not the same. It's something different. Right. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about with Tolkien, but we do get this idea. And I was thinking about this earlier, is like canon in the way that I see it, canon is not only it, I feel like canon is both situational and generational.
Mm.
So if you are, let's say that somebody is going to write a book that is based in the world that Tolkien created, I would want that book to follow some relatively strict guidelines,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the medium that it was created in the first place, and it's easier to follow those guidelines in the medium that it's created in, right? But once we convert that over to TV, to movies, to even audio production and things like that, it's a very different medium. It's like saying that, like, if I tell you a story that and I want you to paint a picture as an artist, that somehow I expect that picture to be exactly what I'm telling you. That's chaos. You can't do that.
Right.
Right? Like you can't
It's an
go from
interpretation.
you can't go from one medium to another. Now, there can be certain guidelines and everything, but I mean, as you said, it gets even more confusing as we go on. And I'm not going to monopolize this right now. I'll go into this
I will
part later. But
later.
like,
I will
yeah, but
monopolize
like,
it soon.
Yeah.
it just like it gets even more chaotic when we're talking about Tolkien because he is, in my mind, very similar. And Neil Gaiman, if you ever listen to this, I know that you'll love what I'm about to say. But he is, in my mind, very similar to Neil Gaiman in the fact that Neil Gaiman changes his mind on his story. So he published American Gods,
Mhm.
right? And then Showtime came to them and said, "Hey, we want to do a TV series. I would like you to write it." And Neil Gaiman said, "Okay." And he changed a bunch of stuff for that TV series. And it's his story. He can do what he wants.
Mhm.
And people are, saying like, "Oh, well, it's not canon." Who the fuck sorry. Who is it to say that it's not canon when it's the writer that's doing it?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's an
Right? If
interesting idea as far because I feel like we're we, like how many times have we heard unprecedented times but in our lifetimes at this point, but like
Oh
as
my
far
goodness.
as a writer of a book, I don't think typically you would always have like it wasn't just assumed that they would be a part of like the movie or the TV show, but then would think like even when Netflix worked with Daniel Handler for a series of unfortunate events, I mean was such that was so great because it was not it felt true to the books, but then we also see Daniel as one of the writers like expanding on the this kind of story and world that he had previously created, so and then we have George R. Martin, working on House of the Dragon like right now, and you can see how he is commenting on like changes that the show is making, but obviously like with somewhat of his blessing where and
Mhm.
that's something that I don't think Tolkien ever would have even imagined have happening, right? Like I know that
right.
there are notes of him with like the BBC going back and forth about an adaptation, and him helping them with changes or critiquing things, but I mean one of the stipulations, right, when he sold the rights was either I'm going to have a lot of control or you're going to pay me a good chunk of money and to for me to not be involved, and he ended up taking the money route just as far as the how that happened, so he didn't really expect to be like a part of it, but it's just so interesting to think about how it's almost like there's movie, like the way the movie presents it. So is that like movie canon? Is that how you talk about it? Like, is it like, do we only talk about canon in relation to the original source material? And even then with Tolkien, it's like, there, do we
There's
consider the Silmarillion canon, but even though it wasn't like him publishing it, you know?
Right.
Yeah, it's based on his works, right? So, what's canon? Canon is, if you're going to go, it's what the author published. It's The Hobbit, it's The Lord of the Rings. I don't know if it's The Adventures of Tom
Yeah, it
Bombadil
is.
so much. I don't know how much of that is, tied to, if we're just talking about Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth and that world. Even The Hobbit wasn't supposed to be part of that world
Mm-hmm.
originally anyways, right? And
Right.
then he retconned it, and so at that point then it becomes part of the canon. And with the Silmarillion, I mean, a lot of that was his own writing, but a lot of it was also unfinished.
Mm-hmm.
And it was conversations or correspondence that he had had with his son. And so, do you extend that ability to add to the canon to the son, right? So if George Lucas doesn't sell Star Wars to Disney, does his kid now get to comment on what his dad said about, oh, actually, midichlorians are actually, they're even more microscopic than that, and they
Mm-hmm.
have their own civilizations and they're alive or whatever, right? That would really take it to another level for Star Wars
Yes,
fans and
sure would.
make them explode their heads, right? Um, uh, so, so yeah, I think canon is, it's, it's tricky to kind of not to define, but to determine. And that's the problem, is I think the people who are making that determination are the people who are in love with the material.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get issues, right? Is then
Mhm.
you have people who decide, well, this isn't canon and your interpretation of this is not correct, right? So again, with the show that we have, never really said anything about, skin color or anything like that, and that there definitely weren't any elves who were black. But now we have it in the show, and so the show is to a certain extent canon for the Lord of the Rings, much as people don't want to admit it.
Well, and I do like too the point that you made, Andy, just now, of the idea of like, and it ties a little bit back to the Marvel thing, but a lot of other stuff too is the in media canon,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like, is there a separate canon for, and maybe not even just in media. I mean, we were told, now it seems to be maybe not, because of some things that I don't love, but we were told that Rings of Power was not a prequel to the Peter Jackson movies, right? There are things about it now that where
That feels like a lie.
we've seen a Balrog that is pretty much the exact same Balrog, right? And we've seen like things like that. But I would have rathered it not be, because in my mind, that means that it is a different universe. It is a different canon, right? It is, yes, it's alive under the same base rules and the same story, but it doesn't have to live by the rules that somebody else interpreted.
It's its own telling.
Mm.
I disagree with you, right? On that,
About what?
we've
Fight
talked about
me.
the Balrog, right? We've talked about the Balrog.
It
So
shouldn't be there.
let me ask you this. All right. Someone wrote a story about a unicorn a long time ago, right? What does that unicorn look like?
No, but that's the point, is the way that Tolkien describes a Balrog is nothing like the one in Peter Jackson's movie.
It just
Zero.
it has wings, right? I think that's the only difference.
No, it
I don't
says
think
it's in the shape of a person, like a personage, like surrounded by fire. It looks nothing like a bull-headed thing with a whip and a tail and shit. Like, I mean, it does have a whip, but it's a person's very specific interpretation of it,
I
and
don't know
not
if
the
it's-
creator's interpretation.
Okay, I will still disagree with you on that, and we've
Well,
had
fight
this
me.
conversation on our
We
show
have.
before, because
If you'd like to hear more about it.
Yeah. And,
Which episode was that again?
Yeah, right.
it was whichever one where the Balrog came. You see it in the Rings of Power.
Mm.
Yeah.
Again, you're really kind of basing it off of the culture, right? A little bit, and that Balrog is now part of
And that does
shared human culture,
right, and that
So
does
when
go
you're-
into the idea of like a generational canon.
I'm talking.
Well, I talked over you.
It's chaos on this episode.
How is he not used to this by now? No, go ahead.
when that Balrog, right, who is now part of the human culture and fabric of what we know what a Balrog might look like, because we've been told that by Peter Jackson in the movies and everyone's seen it, right? And then you go and you're gonna make your own thing. Yeah, you're probably going to borrow on it. You're not going to change it dramatically, because you also have all these other people who have either grown up watching it or want to go see the movies, and that's what they see a Balrog as. So if you change it and you make it look like Chris
Boring.
with a sweater, with a bespoke sweater and an Irish cap, right, and
It's
a whip,
just Sweater Dad Balrog.
sweater dad Balrog, right?
If anyone is an artist and
you
listening to
know.
this, please draw me that.
Sweater Dad Balrog.
Mila, are you
you're going to
listening?
make people upset, because then they're going to be like, well, that's not canon.
No,
But,
that's boring.
And then
That's
you go,
boring.
and then you
I'm
go
sorry.
say, well, the Balrog that Peter Jackson did wasn't canon.
That's lazy.
So anyway, that's all I'm saying, right?
So
that is what the image is of a Balrog. And so
Right.
when
No, and I
created.
get that.
But also,
I
I
that's
understand.
mean,
what I
that-
said on our show.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that just goes back to like the generational thing, because I mean, we've heard it in interviews, but also you can tell by the way that this show was written and designed. Like the showrunners are huge fans of the movies, and that was both of their introductions to Tolkien. And so I don't I understand the idea of wanting to like have some of those callbacks or whatever, but I also think that like something that I've noticed over the years, in various fandom spaces is this proclivity for wanting to know like all the facts about these worlds, or like truths. I mean, I'm putting this in air quotes, about the respective literature. And I would kind of like to push back against that idea of like, because I think that the more we obsess over the minutia of these stories, like I worry that like broadly speaking we don't engage with them on a deeper level, and so it just becomes of like, well, no, this is the truth, no, this is what happened, you know what I mean? And it just becomes this
Yeah.
like weird, like superficial conversation when we could take the orcs for example, like the how the orcs were made, and it's like they were definitely made by Morgoth, like tortured elves. No, they were made of like they were their own thing. No, they were tortured humans. And I think that like it's like kind of just, it can become kind of just like shouting over each other and kind of a stunted argument, when it's like I don't think stuff like that should necessarily be an argument, but more of like a discussion on Tolkien, like watching an author struggle with this idea and not really land anywhere. I think that that's
Mhm.
vastly more
Mm-hmm.
interesting. And to just, instead of saying like yes to one and no to the others, because at this point we only have what we have, all that we're going to get, basically, about things like that, or like Galadriel's background, or Gilgalad's or father.
Parentage.
Yes, that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Who is Gilgalad's father?
nobody knows.
That is going
Who
to
be
come up
his
in, that
daddy?
is going to come up in trivia at some point. I'm going to force it,
Ruh-roh.
and then Peter's going to be mad.
But it's one of those things where it's like you kind of have to say all, you know what I mean, in
Yeah.
a way.
Yeah.
But then when we get stuck in these like conversations about what is correct or true, I think it kind of doesn't. To me, that makes me think that you're not maybe fully understanding this legendarium is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
Is
I
it
think that's the point, is like what you were saying, this idea of like there's a difference between discussing the small, really cool things of the world and claiming that you know what is true in the world
Mm-hmm.
when the writer himself was constantly changing,
right?
Yeah.
right? So like
Like the
it's
orcs.
fun. Yeah, so like the orcs, right? It's fun to talk about the different places that he believed they came from, and the dilemma that he felt of including characters that were base evil, right? And like what that meant, and having no redemption, and how he had to reconcile that with the world itself and everything else. I think things like that are cool. I think things like that give us then what we got in Rings of Power,
Mm-hmm.
of this huge moment of like, okay, this elf fully believes that they were created from the one, just like the elves, and that they have spirits and souls like they are. These orcs are entities in and of themselves. They're not just evil. They're not just base evil, right? And we get to have that because of this kind of debate that Tolkien had with himself.
Yeah, and
I
that's the
think
kind of stuff
I
that I love that the Rings of Power did, where it's like reading between the lines a little bit and then trying to show like how we could potentially have both in a way, but also like playing with that idea, because I feel like, especially when you're thinking about just using Lord of the Rings only as your source material and not all of these other things, like you do, there's and again there's like a lot, as we know from our podcast, that they cut out a lot of things from the orcs in the movies, and that's like there's a lot of conversations and like obvious interpersonal relationships they have with each other that is
Mhm.
gone, but you can see them kind of having I wouldn't say like morality discussions, but they're like making plans for their lives as well. and
Right,
how
that whole moment with Shagrat, and I can't
mm-hmm.
remember the other one, but
They also
like
have
Gorebag.
restaurants.
I want to say
Gorebag.
Gorbag. Yeah.
I feel like Gorebag is correct.
Shagrat and Gorbag just kind of go
They
together.
do. They do.
But I like no, you're right there, and it's this idea of like you have to look in the context if you're gonna sit here and like argue like published works is canon,
Mm-hmm.
and published by the author himself. The issue that you run into there is, especially with these older authors, um, they did not make a lot of money, right? Um, I can guarantee you that Tolkien would have rathered spent more time fleshing it out
Mm-hmm.
before he published it. But he didn't have the time and he didn't have the resources to do that. Right? Like he didn't have the he was a professor at Oxford. He was doing work there. He was, but like it's not like he was a rich man. We know that. We know that in the end, and it's one of the saddest things is before he died, he started selling off his library because he didn't have a whole lot of money to leave his family with. Of course, then after he dies, Lord of the Rings in the 70s goes nuts,
Right.
and just makes, you know, the
Pissed.
yeah, it just makes tons and tons of money for the family, right?
Yep.
But like he didn't know that, and in the time he didn't have that luxury. He wasn't wealthy. He and his family um, lived a very like middle class life, and so in order to make money, in order to do what he needed to do, he put out more books. And you know, the last thing that he wrote down on like paper was a completely different backstory for Galadriel.
Mm-hmm.
Like completely different. So are you telling me that like what he wrote at the end of his life, once he is like mentally fleshed out this wonderful world, that's not canon, but what he wrote in order to make a paycheck is? Like that's just a weird way to look at it, is
Yeah.
especially in this type of situation, which again goes to your thing of like, it's a very hard discussion to talk about canon with Tolkien outside of the things that like were never changed and never questioned. And
Right.
even that, he writes in the ability to question it,
Mm-hmm.
because this entire narrative that is written, even what we call the like canonical The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, is all by a oh, what's the literary term? A
Ghostwriter.
no, an um what's the term? An unreliable narrator.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
Oh.
Because technically he is like in the book, in the canon, he is translating these pieces.
Right.
This translation comes from many authors who weren't even there during the stories that were being taken place. They are simply filling in gaps and talking to the people who are there. So it is a complete story filled with unreliable narrator and like plot holes, right? And I think that's great. I think that's a good way to do it, because then if he is asked the question at any point in his life, he's like, I don't know, like it could have changed. It could be different.
Yeah, and what I love about, I mean, personally, one of the things that I always loved about Lord of the Rings is that like he's laying a lot of breadcrumbs, and even like in the later works that we get, it's still like that, but he leaves room for your imagination to take things further, you know, to like add to it or to give it to make it meaningful for you. And I just when we get stuck on like the facts and figures of these stories, I'm like I mean because it's like for me, I mean I love some trivia, like I'm not gonna lie, like that is all that I watched after I broke my collarbone when I was 20, like was just game shows over and over. But at the same time, like when you're with a story like this that is so epic in scale, like I just, I think it can get lost a little bit when you're like, I don't know. I've just seen, like, not with you guys or like any of my friends, but just, you see conversations online, and I'm like, why are you guys stuck on this one fact or like this one
Right.
happening when it's like, have you, or, like, why do you care? What does that say
Right.
about the story? Like, just like get.
Well, and what does it say more about the person who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like that's the thing is like what is it that you are actually trying to say? And that's I think what we get a lot is we get just a lot of when nowadays the word canon
Mm-hmm.
is like almost right away a dog whistle.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and it's because it's this way that people try, but that is one of the big problems with things like Tolkien, and it's honestly one of my favorite things is when people try to use that on like TikTok or Instagram or whatever. I can shoot right back and be like, yeah, but he also wrote this.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, what are you going to tell me is canon? Because if you're going to talk about published works, let's talk about published works and how The Hobbit was not published that way. Are you going to tell me that it's not canon the way that it is now currently published? Because that's not how it was first. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like, there are great ways to do, I feel like we do a decent job at the trivia thing where with like that, right?
Yeah.
What are the names of the two orcs that were deciding to leave? That is a factual statement, right? It's Shagrat and Gorband. Or Gorband, is that what it was?
Gorbag.
Gorbag. So it's like
a bag of
those,
gore.
you know what I mean? Like
Gorbander is like a
like,
salamander offshoot.
but that's it. Like that's a question. Like that's a trivia question.
Yeah.
It just is, right? Like that is.
Callie, write it down.
But to ask,
Yep. Taking notes. Taking notes.
but to Carlos's point, to ask who is the father of Gilgalad, that is it. Like I don't know that you can technically ask that in a trivia.
Yeah.
Sure you
because
can.
you've got two true answers.
There's two answers.
Yeah.
Who are the two dads of Gilgalad?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
oh man, that would piss people off.
And
We're
would.
gonna
You'd have people going, well, if you read
gonna
this, but if you did this.
We're gonna do what Andy said. We're gonna make it more difficult. That's gonna be on the more difficult.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, that's that bottom category of the difficult.
Your top tier. Only
but
the elites.
No, it is like it's interesting, and like I said, like it's tough because me being the type of person that, I mean, Carlos and I have said it multiple times, we both like the Hobbit movies. We both very much enjoy them.
And if it's canon.
Yeah, like it's like, and it like, I mean, to be completely honest, overall, it's canon. Like if you're telling me that the entire, and this isn't even headcanon, this is Peter Jackson canon, all three movies we are being told to us by Bilbo. Not a single one of these.
No. It's not all three Hobbit movies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's what I'm saying.
Sorry,
so like Peter Jackson set that up at the beginning and at the end, is that in these three movies, Bilbo is telling us a story. And if you're telling me that Bilbo is not telling tales out of school, you're wrong, because that is how Bilbo talks.
The movie starts with Bilbo the day Gandalf arrives for his 111th birthday party, and it ends with Bilbo telling Gandalf to get lost, and Gandalf being like, "No, it's me, dickhead."
Yeah.
And then it's the exact same scene from the movie. So the movie flows with the continuity of Peter Jackson's other films, right? There are things in the movie that are ridiculous and are sins, right? They're movie sins. I've been watching a lot of cinema sins on YouTube. And so, that is, what it is, but Bilbo is an exaggerator, right? We see that in the movie when he's talking to the kids about the dragon. We also read it in the way Tolkien retconned the Hobbit, right? We're told that the original story that Tolkien published of the Hobbit was what Bilbo had told the dwarves, right?
Yeah.
I found this, it was a gift, blah blah blah.
This is why we never skip the
right?
prologue of Fellowship.
Right. And then and then he retcons it, and then it and then you have the part where he actually won it in the contest from Gollum, and he did that because of the ring and the power and pull of the ring. So Bilbo likes to tell tall tales, and you see that in the movie, in the way the movie's filmed, because the film is very cartoony and very like tall tale-ish, right?
Yeah.
You expect like Paul Bunyan to walk out of it at some
100%.
Which we kind of get as Bjorn,
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of as Bjorn. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, if I could.
You got Rock'em Sock'em Robots, right? I'm really showcasing my elder millennial status. So yeah, people can either you can like the film or you can dislike the film, but the film is for the most part, if you kind of look at it together, they fit together. It's canon for the films. Right? At least for that part, right? It's Peter Jackson canon.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Peter Jackson. And what's funny to think about with Lord of the Rings, this is something I was talking about with Nick, was just how, like, it has kind of defined a generation of nerds in a lot of ways. And so then when you have, Peter stepping in to finish The Hobbit, I think that while I know that there are people that do dislike it, I don't think that there was any, like, there wasn't like backlash, you know what I mean, like that we see today in a lot of fandom spaces, like not just Rings of Power, but like we saw it with I mean,
I feel like you can chalk that up to Martin Freeman. I mean, who's going to be mad at Martin Freeman as Bilbo?
Right.
Like,
and like we're still getting in, and like so many people are back, and like the performances are great, but it's just interesting to think about how, like, I think that there's probably a nostalgia factor there, and I know, but at the same time I know that The Hobbit was a lot of it was the intro for a lot of people, but at the same time, if you were really young, you still had Lord of the Rings probably on DVDs that you could revisit. So it's just interesting to think about how Peter has kind of set like a generational feel for what Lord of the Rings is, and that is probably very different for people that grew up watching the 70s and 80s versions of the cartoons, where it's more like, and I think people give cartoons a lot of flexibility, where it's like, sure, almost like the way that we view just artwork in general, like stuff from the calendars, or like things in the illustrated edition, like Ted Nasmith or whatever. It's like it kind of gets a pass in some ways, like, yeah, that was a little crazy, but it's fine because it's a cartoon. But it's almost like, I think that we should have more of a flexible view of like any adaptation or interpretation like that, because it's all like,
I feel like that's the big point there, right? Is like just being able to have that flexibility in everything. Like I don't love I love audio dramas. I do not like the BBC audio drama of Lord of the Rings. But like that doesn't, I also don't argue that it's because it's not canon. I just don't like it because I don't like some of the voices and like the sound effects and stuff that they did.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That makes me think of, like, you see a lot of, and I know that this isn't all of the things, but part of discussions you've seen about how, like, people like an adaptation based on how correct it is or something, and I'm like, that isn't really how you should be entering that space. I think you're just going to set yourself up for disappointment, because it's like, maybe Peter Jackson did capture the way you had viewed Middle Earth. I think that it what Lord of the Rings did for me, it captured a lot of vibes, but not necessarily the exact like look or feel that I had originally had. It's an interesting to be cognizant of as far as like how are you defining correct in any of these, because there, as we've mentioned, there is so much to it, and there are so many different perspectives and lenses that every adaptation filters through to get to the final product. It's just like, yeah, there is some flexibility that you as an audience member, I think, are need to have, especially if you're someone with already have knowledge about the work or the world that the thing is set in.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, and I think that's the other piece of this. I mean, we touched on it a little bit already, but it's the other piece of this whole canon argument, right? Of like, is it that it's not canonical, or is it that it's not what was in your head? And why is that what's making you upset?
Mm-hmm.
And why are you upset in the first place? Because there are a lot of artistic interpretations of Middle Earth that I don't like. So I don't see them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, it's like I don't enjoy. So infamous Nocturnal, Frederick.
Yes.
He posted a picture of Turin and Glaurung, and it is the only picture of Turin and Glaurung that I've ever enjoyed. And the reason why is because I feel like artistic interpretations of Glaurung, they always make him too small. Like the way that like he's described, Glaurung is always like described, or he's described. I mean, he's the father of dragons, right? He's huge. He's not Ancalagon the Black huge,
No.
but he's huge. And so this one interpretation of it that Frederick posted, I was like, I love that. I screenshotted it. I saved it. I don't do that with most artistic interpretations of Middle Earth. I don't have the Middle Earth calendar because I don't really love a lot of the artistic interpretations. That doesn't mean that I'm going to sit there and look at them and say that they're not canonical, or that they're not this, or that they're not
they're wrong.
that.
Yeah, I think that it's like
right.
we have, I think with the way that we have learned to interact with a lot of these major franchises and IPs and that kind of thing is to I don't know, have kind of an expectation that everything should be kind of handed to us in some ways. And I think that not always, but you know what I mean. I think that there's a little bit more um less room for interpretation of like the full story, if that makes sense. And so I think when it comes to thinking about things like Tolkien and the world of, you know, and everything in Middle Earth, I think it's just like not only having like flexibility when it comes to a new adaptation, but also just kind of understanding that there is it's a little bit of an academic pursuit in trying to understand all the things that have happened or have gone on inside the world, and but also because you have to consider Tolkien as a man and his experiences, and him as someone who is really obsessed with like perfecting it and trying to get it right, but because of his death, you know, we're left with more than what maybe should be canon, but we'll never know, right? So it's like when we come to conversations that center around the facts of it, I think it's just like we need to have like a more open definition of that. But I also really primarily want to encourage, you know, readers and watchers and listeners to think more about like why do you need to have that conversation versus another one about Middle Earth, you know, and like can we deepen that conversation to go beyond and to think more about like what the story is telling us and those types of conversations.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the idea of like, if you are a person who decides that you want to argue whether or not something is canon, right? Try to first decide why you want that conversation, right? And then in even then, if you decide no, this is still a conversation that I want to have, if you are being genuine and like true to the idea of it, then think to yourself, why do I believe this specific thing is canon? Because we not only is, and you know, Ariel's done a really good job at kind of helping me realize that it's like it is okay to enjoy a work, a fandom, and other things, and still see the flaws in the creator, right?
Absolutely.
And like there are still flaws in the creator of Middle Earth. Now, I feel like that there are definitely people who are trying to make interpretations of these that are trying to not necessarily rectify those flaws, but make it less glaring, right? And so
And I think that
like
just to piggyback off that, it's that when I see this a lot when, fans find themselves like loving something so much, they have a hard time seeing problems with things, and or with the author or anything like that. And it's like I think that you need to be um you can still enjoy something and be critical of it. And I think that there's multiple ways to interpret critical, just thinking about like um critical and so far as like the interpretation of the work, or how the story, like what we were just talking about, like with the story, or critical of the author. But I think the big point there, like not putting these on like pedestals really. And it's
Yeah.
right. And what you
Not
were saying, and
and
kind of
that's
what I
kind
was getting to as well,
oh,
was be critical as the reader as well.
yeah.
I was
Like,
just
be
gonna
critical of yourself.
yeah, I was just gonna add that's kind of how our approach is to our podcast, right?
Yeah.
And we've said it before. It's like we don't. There are people who hold out Tolkien's work to be gospel,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's sacrilegious to talk about it any other way than with reverence. Yeah, we don't do that.
Yeah.
We do not do that.
We do not do that on our show, and I think that's fine, because again, it's it's a work, and we enjoy it, and we're not like talking about it to criticize it, but we talk about it in a way that doesn't hold it like as
Yeah.
holy
Well,
as
it's
scripture.
hard to engage with a work on that level if you're just going to be like, "No, no, it's perfect. Don't
Yeah,
Right.
touch it." You know what I mean? Like it's hard to have those deeper conversations and get to broader understandings of of not just the story, but the author. And like how can you include all of these things that we've talked about if you're not willing to be more critical? So
Yeah, and like, and not take everything, like, Carlos was saying, and it's not to say that, like, if you are a person who sees it as a nearly like holy work, and it's helped you through your life or anything else, right? That's great. I'm not like,
yeah,
I am not going to like talk down to you on that, but holding other people to that same
yeah.
standard,
yeah.
right? Like, that's where it falls short, because like
You
that's
have to love
where
it this way because
yeah.
Right. Like
this is
because
what it did
this
for me.
right,
It's like that's
exactly.
great for you, right? And that's again, it's artistic interpretation of it, and it's just like music, right? Music affects people differently.
Mhm.
Reading stories affects people differently, and so
And there are
uh,
some people that, like, honestly, like, some people get a lot out of these stories. Some people see themselves in characters. Some people, all of these other things. Other people just really like reading cool shit.
yeah,
And then I
You know
think
what I mean?
we get to this point where, like, on the flippity side, where we have people having these conversations about like what is right, what is correct, like getting into the weeds a little bit. And then I think that intimidates new people coming into the fandom and trying to be like, well,
Yeah.
like I see it all the time where people be like, well, I don't know as much as so and so, or I don't really know that. So I'm like, no, it doesn't matter. Like you should be participating in this, because honestly, fresh perspectives are what keep fandoms going, and what
Right.
makes it enjoyable for everybody. So that's also like a call out. It's like things to be wary of, I guess, as a fan. Just like, how are you
Yeah.
creating a space that isn't that is too rigid, and therefore doesn't allow for a broader understanding, or just like a welcoming space in general.
Yeah. No, and you know Carlos said it best back in our, if you guys want to listen to a very depressing episode, back in the State of Swolhirrim episode, I'm pretty sure it's episode like 36 or something like that. You can go back, take a look at that. But Carlos said it best in that episode and he said a few things in that episode that really kind of still stick with me. One of them is that, like, people fear what's not in their head. If they see something on the screen and that's not what they were thinking of the entire time, it's an automatic like, hold up, wait, right? And the other thing is this idea of what you were talking about, of curating a space, right? And it's not to say that you don't allow people in, or it's this constant like echo chamber, but it is the idea of making sure that people know, I mean, in a dick manner a little bit, who's welcome and who's not, right? And I will welcome anybody who's saying like, yeah, this is my very first time reading Lord of the Rings, this is how I feel about it, I love the show, or I don't like the show but I want to learn about it, or whatever, as opposed to somebody who comes in and is like, well, back in the 70s I read this and I did this and I've been doing this for this long. And I'm like, I don't care, man. I don't care. Because if you come in with that type of attitude, all you're going to do is make people feel like they don't know enough.
Yeah.
Like they don't know enough. They're not a nerd
and
enough.
That they'll never
they're not
reach
a fan enough.
and that's basically like, especially when you put it in terms of like years, like, yeah, we get it. You've had a really good head start, and it makes you feel kind of like you can never catch up. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I literally
just wait till you're dead, old
yeah.
man.
I'll
got all my
I'm
years.
still
on me
learning.
But
but it
yeah. No, we just said the same thing at the same. It was, but yeah.
But it's just an interesting, and it just keeps calling back to this, which is sad, but it's part of the world that we live in. It's something that we all talk about. We have talked about before, is just this idea that like, if we are talking about canon, we can talk about canon all day, and it's fun to do that, and it's fun to talk about changes in canon. We've talked a little bit about that. Carlos talks often about the change between the Hobbits, and I think it's a very cool thing to remember, and those types of conversations are great. It's when people come into a conversation with a "but it's not canon" statement. Right. And those are the conversations that, for me, I'm either going to just ignore you, or I'm going to have a lot of fun with you, in a way that you're not going to enjoy. Right. And it's just like, those are the problems, because these types of things, like, we can talk about the fact that I love that there's an entire chapter in, yes, my favorite book, Unfinished Tales, that is simply dedicated to the like 8 different versions of Celeborn and Galadriel. Yeah. And like who they are and where they came from. And they're all great. They are all amazing. I mean,
and then at that point, it's like, why even shoot? Why even force yourself to choose? Just like, enjoy it. And it also, this is where I'm thinking about, like, isn't it a better conversation to be like, wow, look at how Tolkien is trying to construct these characters. Like, what are the commonalities between these versions? Like, what are the differences? Like, I wonder why he struggled with that, or like was, having that choice. What does that say about how he was trying to construct the character? Do you know what I mean? Like, that is...
Yeah, so it's a very similar thing. So, like, let's take the Galadriel story. It's actually a very similar story to the differences in the orcs, where he has now created this character Galadriel. He went all the way through the Silmarillion with this character Galadriel, who she was becoming, the type of person that she was, and this person grew and grew and grew in his mind, right? To, at the very last story that he wrote, he was like, I can't bring myself to say that she was at the slaughter of Alqualande. I am not going to put her there in that form. I'm going to say that she left first before the Sons of Feanor and anybody, and went to her mother's people in Alqualande and was staying with them when they showed up, right? And then she fought alongside of those fiercely against Feanor, as it says. She fought fiercely against Feanor, right? And it was because he had created this person, this character in his mind, that he got to a point that he was like, I can't bring myself to say that she was at the slaughtering, even if she wasn't participating, that she marched there with Feanor. Like, that's just, it's too difficult for me to actually put out there. So he changed it. And obviously didn't publish that way, right? It didn't publish like that, but he changed it because, like you said, in his mind, these characters grew. And we get to see that in some of these writings, which is, it's really cool.
Yeah. Fascinating.
And I feel like rarely do new Tolkien writings contradict the old ones. They just add on top of it. I'm not saying they don't ever contradict, but they rarely do. I feel like instead of it contradicting, what it does is usually it shows that he has been thinking very hard on these characters, these people, these places, these things.
Right.
And the progress there, instead of just straight up like, oh, I said that, no, it's this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
But, and those are the fun conversations of canon, right? Those are the things, because we get to say, all right, I was gonna say I was gonna say something really dumb. I was gonna say, as scholars, which none of us are. Let's be real.
My dream.
The only reason you're saying that is because of what you're wearing right now.
Like,
I don't even have my pipe. My pipe's right there. I should just like
Professor
no,
Chris.
but like,
wait, you should say this next part with your pipe in.
yeah. She's not gonna. This isn't going on YouTube. This isn't
part
the same
might.
as us.
This part could, yeah.
But so, as people who play around with this, who do podcasts, who have, you know, TikToks about it and stuff like that, we get to be the ones to show that we are comfortable with saying, I don't know, or it's not certain, right? And it's okay to say that. Yeah. It's okay to say it's not certain because he wrote 5 different ways that this could have happened. And it's not certain because we found like some rolled up napkin somewhere where he said, you know, he wrote down something completely different, and they decided to throw that in one of the histories of Middle Earth. And that's cool that we have that opportunity to say that, right? We get to say, and then there's other shit that's insane that's in like the nature of Middle Earth, where he goes into the math of like years and minutes and things like that, and what those, and like that's bananas, but it's fun to talk about, right? Yeah. But I like the whole thing is we get to tell people, if even asked questions of like, well, what is the real story of Galadriel? It's like, well, it depends on what you mean by real. And all in all, we don't know.
And I also think it's, to add to that, it's like it's just hilarious when you think about all the things that he did make notes about, but then also refused to tell us about. Like, we are not gonna find out more about Tom Bombadil ever. Like, he's like, no, you don't get that. But even like,
no, which I love.
Did Shelob die? We'll never know. That tale, we don't go there. You know what I mean?
What happened to the fox?
Yeah, like,
what happened to the fox?
That is what
like,
I
come
want to
on.
know. Somebody write
That's
me.
the real question. And are all foxes that like sentient and like ability to tell, or is it just that one fox? You know,
very unclear. I feel like Radagast might have a better answer for that. I don't even.
Oh, there you go.
Like,
what happened to Radagast?
Right? Did he just peace out after?
Actually, that's a great question. That's something I've literally never thought about.
Really? You've never thought about that?
I have not once thought about what happened to Radagast.
Gandalf. Like, we never revisit him.
Do you
No.
guys ever? I'm sure you guys have seen it. You've seen The Sandlot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the epilogue at the end where they talk about the one kid who got really into the '60s.
Yeah.
That's Radagast.
Yeah.
That's
Radagast is
Radagast.
I love how he was like,
they
the
were
9
to do,
across
like,
the
a-
river, I gotta go, and then he'd
Yeah. If
never
they-
seen again. Like,
Yeah.
okay.
They should do like a 80s end credit of where are they now type of thing.
I would love it.
Aragon went on to be king for 150 more years.
Yeah.
And
Radagast
then he-
smoking a bowl up in the woods. Like,
Radagast got really into the woods and disappeared.
Yeah.
No one ever saw him.
No
again.
one ever saw him again. Some say that he went and shook hands with Tom Bombadil, but we'll never know.
Yeah.
we know Gandalf does, at least.
Yeah.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
No, that's just that. I mean, that's interesting, right? Is like we get, but like I do feel like that is something that helps people who are getting into it as well, because some people really, really, really want to know, right?
Yeah.
They want to know, and I'm not going to fault them for that. Like there are people that are like that are that
I want to know.
yeah, they won't they won't
I tend
take
to be
we
one of those
don't
people.
know for an answer, right? Like they're like, no, I want to know who Tom Bombadil is. Well, too fucking bad, because you're not going to know who Tom Bombadil is.
Yeah,
He
I'm
is
not-
Tom Bombadil.
it's
I'm not that, I'm not that extreme, but there are things where it's like, it'd be nice to know what happened, like to
Right.
have a story on the Fourth Age.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yes.
let's hear more about.
I know. If I had been Tolkien's
Aragorn's reign and what he did, and like how did he, like what were the like I would much rather like want a book about like the political machinations of what Aragorn did to.
besides pardoning
You're an
Reunite the
Aragorn's
two
tax policy kind of guy.
What is his tax policy, right?
I would love.
Did he have an issue with the Trade Federation?
What do you
How
do
was
about
the
the orcs?
reintegration of Umbar? And
Yeah. But like also if I had been Tolkien's publisher and he'd given me Lord of the Rings, I mean this is really nice, but also like I see you have some stuff here about what happens after the fact. Could you just give me a novel of like the Shire post ring destruction?
Well, and
please.
he even says something about that, right? Like there's in one of the letters, it's either in the foreword or something on might be the Silmarillion. But he has a letter about that saying like, yeah, philologists want to know more about the language. Horticulturists want to know more about the plants. And he's like, I'm sorry guys, but I'm not going to give you all of that.
Yeah.
Like I'm just not.
That's rude.
And there's a little bit of mystery in that's kind of fun.
Agreed.
And that's where the adaptations come into play, right? Because then you have these things that you could fill in, and I think that's what gets lost when people like focus on the canon. Is like, no, now you get to interpret like what is the fall of the Northern Kingdom of Arnor, like what happened when the last kingdom fell, right? Like, give me a story about that. Like, no one's written anything really about it. That you have general concept, you have general outline of what happened, right?
Yeah.
The king ended up dying and blah blah blah, but like there's not really a whole lot else in there, and you could definitely do a little mini series about that.
And that's
Well,
where
the
I
funny
found
thing
like
is you just go ahead.
I was
sorry.
just gonna say that's where I found that the Rings of Power like did really well is when they played in these like negative spaces, where they added to things that we don't have any information on, like I really loved the Arondir Bronwyn stuff, or the things that they did with the Harfoots, or Adar was a huge plus for me. I think that when they expanded on things like that is where they really were able to shine, whereas like I think they struggled with things like the elves, who we kind of have a the other like the previously named elves I should say, because Arondir was a badass, but
Keep going.
so I was just gonna say that I was really the end of my point, but but just how when you
Too bad. Keep going.
just how
Filler.
yeah, just how those
He's getting his pipe.
of course those new things. I think that's really where I think that there's a lot of hope for adaptations of these works.
I was just kidding.
All right, so this is for Carlos.
You really did
because
get us
Carlos just gave me. I just had an epiphany. I have now decided. Yep, I broke out the pipe. Everybody, okay. So I have. Man, this smells good.
Cackling.
I have now just decided that canon only matters to the author. Canon can only matter to the author because any person who reads a story is interpreting it in their own head. So the only reason that canon matters is so that an author can keep continuity in a story. Outside of that, your canon doesn't matter. Because we are all, every single one of us, when we pick up a pile of dead trees with ink, we are interpreting in our head what we believe, and those interpretations are based on, yes, some of the words that we are reading, but also our biases, our own individual biases in our own lives, our own thoughts and feelings about how something should look, how something should feel, how something, even with the grandeur of Tolkien being able to describe things, he still leaves things unsaid that leaves it up to us in our own head. So the only reason why canon is even a thing is so that an author can keep continuity in his own stories.
Boom.
Outside of that, or his or her, sorry. I used the royal he there.
You're just talking about Tolkien at that point.
That was your biases.
That was my biases right there, right? But yeah, like that was Carlos. That was on Carlos right there. He talked about interpreting our thoughts in it, and yeah, I mean, because why else does it matter? Like, it really doesn't. The only thing that canon matters for is for somebody. So like, I mean, like, I don't read the books, but like, if we want to talk about canon and authors, like, I does that mean that the later Wheel of Time books are not canon? Right? Because if we're going to say that it has to be written by the same author, then they're not. But if we're saying that author is simply keeping the continuity, the canon only exists so that author can keep the continuity, then it doesn't matter. The rest is just interpretation.
Yeah, and it was interesting, like, when I was looking up the different definitions, a lot of them were putting it in terms of the canon mattered because it was something for fans to build off of in their fan fiction, like something like parameters for them to work within, or not, but just having, like, it's almost like knowing the rules so you can break them kind of thing. Like,
Right.
you have, like, the setup and you get a feel for these characters so that you can then go off and expand on them. So
yeah, I guess the canon only, the only purpose it really should serve is to like rein you in, right? Not to like have like Luke Skywalker all of a sudden decide like he's gonna have a battle with Aragorn, right? And he's like,
right.
That is not like,
right, they would never meet.
Ridiculous, right? They would never meet.
Yeah. The person arguing with me saying that, why don't they have lasers in Middle Earth? It's like, well, because that's stupid.
Gosh,
like, calm down.
This is dumb, right? And so it's just like, as long as you're kind of, as long as you're like if you're talking about it in that world, right? I don't think anything is off limits, and especially when you're forced to fill in the gaps. When you're forced to fill in the gaps, then fill them in however it works.
And it's what our brain does anyway.
Yeah,
it's what we all do.
It's what we do. It's what we do with history.
Right.
Like,
right.
Like, we have all these like historical like shows about things that have happened, and it's people's interpretations that we ultimately end up seeing on like in film and stuff like that. Like, those conversations didn't happen, right? Those relationships didn't happen. Those people didn't look or smell as nice as they probably do in the show.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's everything is interpreted. Nothing is canon. I think that's
and I guess that's really like why I would say I would love for, as Andy said, I would love for most, if not all, of our conversations, at least in our fandom. I'm not going to stick my nose in other people's fandoms, right? But at least in our fandom, that our conversations on canon stick more to the idea of some things we don't know, and let's talk about why.
Yeah.
Right? Like, let's talk about why the changes were made, and not state things as as fact
Mm-hmm.
when they were written multiple different ways.
Yeah.
Right? And like, we can have conversations about that. We can talk about the moral and ethical conundrums of a Galadriel that was a part of, not part of, but part of the kinslaying of her own family. We can talk about and what that did to Tolkien. We can talk about the ethical issues of orcs. We can talk about even the ethical issues of dwarves, because in the beginning, in Book of Lost Tales, dwarves were not from Aule. They were creatures of Melkor.
Wow.
And so, like, but those things changed over time.
Yeah.
Right. And it's fun to talk about those things instead of getting in the weeds of no, because it was written at this time and published at this time,
Yes.
and this specific person said this thing, well, then that's canon. Like,
right.
Yeah. I think that that's probably like the moral of the story. Like, don't get caught in things like that where it like, that is literally like what definition of trivial. Like, don't like, not just knowing things for knowing things sake. Like, let's open up that conversation and also think about the implications of having such a rigid conversation and how that affects other fans that you may not be thinking about. And I think that I feel like we've reached a consensus in a lot of ways, but one thing I do want to touch on, with Callie, is just about like curating those spaces. I feel like you're the expert, like you're the only one that has really done that, and like curating these spaces that do allow for these types of conversations to happen. And so I would just love to hear like your perspective on that, and like working within fandoms and organizing within fandoms to create spaces that allow for these types of discussions to happen.
I'm not sure, I'm not entirely sure what you mean. Do you mean like through the Discord?
Yeah, like I
or-
mean, you started that. I mean, that's how we all know each other, right? Like, it's I think it's one of those things where it's like you see people join the Discord and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I found this." Like I was in like Facebook groups or whatever where it was kind of negative and they didn't have a place to express their love for these works because it was operating under these like rigid rules, and also probably like racist and misogynistic. Like, that's a whole other conversation, but you see that where people get intimidated by like hardcore fans. But I feel like in our Discord, it's got like pretty much everybody from every part of, like, I've only watched the movies and that's it, but they're there and they're having a good time, or like I've read all of it and they're also just having the same great conversations with everyone else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, at this point, I'm very proud to say that the Discord pretty much runs itself. The community is amazing and has come together and is becoming really an organism of its own, and I'm so proud of it and I'm so happy.
Just imagine you as like a little gardener. Like, you planted the seed.
Yeah, and like part of that, like to go with that analogy, was making enough room for some people to grow. Like the Swolhirrim themselves, like they were very, very, very early addition to the Discord, but as soon as I heard about them and how hard they work on the projects they do, and what a fantastic job they do with their own podcast, I was like, well, you definitely need a space, and And I find when you give people, that plot and that room to grow, that they do. So I think that has probably been my guiding, thing
Yeah.
as I've been creating the Discord and creating the community, is giving everyone a chance to have their voice and have their voice appreciated. And in that way the community is great. As soon as someone posts something, there's 3 or 4 new and different people, and it's not always the same people, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Unless you
Just
have a cave
chiming in
troll.
and like being really positive, and I love that.
Yeah, it's just like it blows my mind a lot of the time where like I know that we've had like maybe a couple of bad apples that have left or we've kicked, but for the most part it's been like really chill. You know what I mean? And it's just like we
Yeah.
were all just floating out there in the ether, like wondering who we were supposed to be hanging out with. And then this Discord is created and it's just miraculous to me how everybody like ended up there, you know?
And I do think people do a good job at kind of self-regulating in it as well. You know what I mean? Like, okay, maybe I don't jive with this person, maybe I don't interact with that person that
Mhm.
much, but it doesn't mean that that person is like overall, yeah, like you said, like they're not toxic people,
Yeah.
right? They're
No, they're
everyone,
not gonna like ruin the whole conversation for
right?
everyone, which I really appreciate. We don't really have, and that's why I mean, like, it's very difficult for me to take any credit for it at this point, because it's really like run by the community itself,
All of the credit
and the
goes to
community
Callie.
being so wonderful
Yeah, we see you try not to take credit,
on
but
their own.
Yeah.
it's you, girl. Like,
And like that's the thing is um
but also join
I
the
don't,
Discord.
but also I think we all have it in our bios now because I finally am not lazy and put it in my link tree in
Same.
TikTok. Heyo.
Yay!
But I mean, like that's the thing that's wonderful about that community that we have. Again, it's not that everybody agrees on everything. There are definitely points of, I mean, we've got a whole thing of respectful debates, right? Like,
Yeah.
Keywords.
and we don't always all agree with, you know, what is this or what is that, but everybody's pretty civil about it. Um, and let's be real, that's all because of Callie.
Yeah.
I
100.
do have a fairly hard, like, no spoons rule. So when you're done with the topic, you express that you're done, and I expect everyone to like respect boundaries and stuff. So maybe I still have some part to play in
Yeah,
it.
I mean, well, there's like setting a precedent, right? And I think that that's what you did.
Yeah.
I mean, especially by curating kind of who was invited in the beginning, you know, kind of setting the tone for what this should look like, you know. I mean, obviously you can't
Mhm.
predict everyone's behavior, but I feel like that in the beginning it was I mean, it was just us, right? Like we were just hanging out, and and it grew from there, you know, as we all started talking about it and people found out about it. And I don't know. I just think it's pretty magical.
It
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
It is.
But is this Discord the canon Discord? Or is there a different Discord that's actually canon?
There's a more canon Discord.
Well, who my brain just melted when you said that. Like, who determines
uh,
the canon of the Discord? Callie?
oh, I think that all falls on Callie's shoulders.
She's the author.
Callie gets all credit, but also has to do all the work. No.
Oh no!
The canon of the Discord only matters for Callie.
Oh, there you go. That's it.
Oh,
That's right.
that was quite an epiphany that you had, a revelation over there, Chris.
That's great.
We'll make sure to reclip that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if I forget, I'm sorry. But no, I won't because we just said it, and this will remind me when I edit it. I mean, does anybody have any final thoughts? I think those were all my thoughts, honestly.
No, I mean, I think this is great. Like I said, I was really glad that this was the one that you know, this one, and I don't think we ever ended up doing it, but one one with Voices of Arda that I was really looking forward to was like the ethics one. And it's just the idea of like canon and ethics and what those mean in the world of Tolkien, and not just in the world of Tolkien, but ethics is and some philosophers might disagree with me, but I feel like ethics in and of itself is also generational. And we've got this idea of like, it's set in stone, and it's like, but is it? Like, nothing else is. So like, why are these specific things, right? So I was really happy when you asked us to be on for this one specifically, because I mean, I love it. I love the idea that we get to talk about um, a world that was created by a man who is now dead, without dictating what it was that he meant or thought or whatever else.
Yeah.
Right.
He left us a lot of wiggle room, which I think is, I don't know if everybody appreciates as much as they maybe should.
Yeah.
They should.
Yeah. Cheers to the wiggle room.
Hey-o.
Hey.
I like that.
That was cute.
Put it on a shirt.
Yeah. That's the next Tolkien with Friends shirt.
I know.
Yeah.
I love it.
I like it.
On sale now for your Christmas? No, I'm just kidding. I have no idea when this episode will air. Because I think this will be like our pre-Hobbit adventure. So I think that this sets a really fun tone, and I'm sure I'll be calling you again whenever I figure out when those recording dates are, since you are my friends that are the ones who most adamantly talk positively about the Hobbit movies.
Yes. We just start on a positive note. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's gonna be so interesting. But yeah, basically once this one comes out, then you can probably expect the next one to be The Hobbit. So
Sweet.
it's crazy.
Love it.
Awesome.
So, Callie, do you have another thought?
No, this was just a really great conversation. It felt like it was had in good company. Like we were able to talk about everything that was on my mind, and I had all the same kind of points, and yeah, it was a good talk.
Yeah, agree. Well, thank you, Swolhirrim.
No,
As
thank you.
always.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And as a reminder, everybody please go like and subscribe, as they say on the internet. Not just us, but to the Swolhirrim as well. They are lovely and wonderful. So thanks again, and we will be seeing all of you soon.